A group of hikers went missing here. I found their footage in an abandoned cabin. The flickering bulb cast long, dancing shadows across the dusty floorboards of the abandoned cabin, each movement threatening to plunge me into complete darkness. Outside, the wind howled like a banshee, clawing at the decaying wooden walls, mirroring the growing unease that coiled in my gut. I shouldn't be here. This place, deep within the Blackwood Forest, had a reputation, a whispered history of unexplained disappearances and unsettling occurrences. But curiosity, a morbid fascination with the unknown, had lured me in. I was a true crime enthusiast, a digital detective who thrived on unraveling mysteries, and the disappearance of the Redwood Trail hikers had been a puzzle I couldn't resist. 5 experienced hikers vanished without a trace 6 months ago. No bodies, no gear, no sign of struggle. Just an empty trailhead and a cloud of speculation. The authorities had given up, declaring it a cold case, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister had happened here. Something that the sterile reports and official investigations had missed. My search had led me to this dilapidated cabin, a structure that wasn't even marked on any maps. Locals whispered stories of its origins, tales of a hermit, a witch, a cult, legends that fueled the forest's already dark reputation. I'd found the cabin unlocked, the door creaking open with an invitation that felt more like a threat. Inside, the air was thick with the musty scent of decay and something else, something indefinably metallic and acrid that made my nostrils burn. Cobwebs draped like macabre decorations, and the furniture, what little remained, was covered in a thick layer of dust. But in the corner, beneath a collapsed section of the roof, I found it. A battered backpack, half buried in debris, and inside the backpack, a camcorder. Its battery was dead, but I had brought a spare, driven by a premonition that this place held the answers I was looking for. Now, hunched over on a rickety stool, the beam of my headlamp cutting through the gloom, I watched as the camcorder sputtered to life, the small screen flickering with static before resolving into an image. The image was shaky, amateurish, but undeniably clear. It showed a group of 5 people, laughing and joking as they hiked through a sun-dappled forest. They were the Redwood Trail hikers. Sarah, the group leader, with her bright smile and practical backpack. Mark, the jokester, always ready with a witty remark. Emily, the quiet observer, her eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. David, the strong and silent type, always carrying the heaviest load. And Jessica, the bubbly and energetic one, documenting their adventure on the camcorder. As I watched, a knot of dread tightened in my stomach. These were real people, vibrant and full of life, and I knew with chilling certainty that I was about to witness their final moments. The first few hours of the footage were uneventful. They hiked, they camped, they shared stories around the campfire. The forest seemed peaceful, idyllic even. But as they ventured deeper into the Redwood Trail, a subtle shift occurred. The atmosphere changed, the laughter became less frequent, and the smiles seemed strained. The trees grew taller, their branches intertwining to blot out the sunlight, casting the trail in perpetual twilight. An oppressive silence descended, broken only by the rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig. Emily, the quiet observer, seemed particularly on edge. She kept looking over her shoulder, her eyes wide with a fear that she couldn't articulate. Several times, she pointed to something off camera, whispering about shadows and strange movements in the trees, but the others dismissed her concerns as nerves. Then they found the symbol, etched into a large, flat rock, partially hidden beneath a layer of moss, was a symbol that made my blood run cold. It was a circle with 3 inward-pointing arrows, an ancient glyph that I recognized from obscure books on folklore and occultism. It was a symbol of binding, of entrapment, of something sinister. Mark, always the irreverent one, joked about it being a sign for a secret pizza party, but even his voice lacked its usual levity. Emily refused to go near it, her face pale with terror. Sarah, ever the pragmatist, took a picture of the symbol and urged everyone to move on, dismissing it as an oddity of nature. But from that moment on, the forest seemed to close in on them. The trail became more difficult, winding through thick undergrowth and treacherous ravines. The sun began to set earlier, casting long, distorted shadows that played tricks on their eyes. They started to get lost, retracing their steps repeatedly, unable to find their way back to the main trail. Frustration grew, tempers flared, and the camaraderie that had initially bound them together began to fray. Then the noises started. At first, they were subtle, almost imperceptible. The rustling of leaves when there was no wind, the snap of twigs when no one was around, the faint whispers that seemed to ride on the breeze. But as night fell, the noises grew louder, more distinct. They heard footsteps crunching through the undergrowth, the snapping of branches, and the chilling sound of something breathing just beyond the circle of their campfire. Mark tried to make light of it, suggesting it was just animals, but his voice trembled with fear. David, the strong and silent type, stood guard with a large stick, his eyes scanning the darkness, but he saw nothing. Emily was paralyzed with terror, huddled in her sleeping bag, whispering prayers under her breath. Jessica, still holding the camcorder, tried to capture the sounds, but all it recorded was static. Sarah, her face etched with worry, decided to move camp, hoping to escape whatever was stalking them. But it followed. No matter how far they went, no matter how fast they walked, the noises persisted, growing closer and more menacing with each passing hour. They were being hunted. The next day, they found the first sign. A small, intricately woven doll, made of twigs and leaves, hanging from a tree branch. Its eyes were made of berries, and its mouth was stitched shut with thorns. Emily screamed when she saw it, convinced that it was a voodoo doll, a representation of one of them, cursed and doomed. Mark tried to reassure her, tearing the doll down and throwing it into the bushes, but the gesture felt hollow, inadequate in the face of the growing terror. That night, David disappeared. One moment he was there, standing guard by the campfire, and the next he was gone. No sound, no struggle, just an empty space where he had been standing. Panic set in. They called his name, searched the surrounding area, but found nothing. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. Fear turned into desperation. They decided to abandon the trail and try to make their way back to civilization. But the forest seemed to be actively working against them. The trees grew denser, the undergrowth thicker, and the path ahead became increasingly difficult to navigate. They were lost, trapped in a labyrinth of their own fear. As I watched the footage, I felt a sense of helplessness wash over me. I knew what was coming. I knew that these people were doomed, and yet I was powerless to help them. I could only watch, a silent observer of their descent into madness. The next few hours of the footage were a blur of terror and confusion. They stumbled through the forest, their clothes torn and dirty, their faces pale and gone. They were running on adrenaline and fear, driven by a primal instinct to survive. But their hope was fading, replaced by a growing sense of despair. They were being watched, hunted by something unseen, something malevolent. Then they found the cabin. Or rather, it found them. They stumbled upon it quite by accident, hidden deep within a clearing, almost completely obscured by the surrounding trees. It was the same cabin I was sitting in now, the same dilapidated structure that had lured me into this nightmare. At first, they were overjoyed at the sight of it, seeing it as a refuge, a place to rest and regroup. But Emily, her eyes wide with terror, recognized the symbol etched into the wooden doorframe, the same symbol they had found on the rock. She tried to warn them, to convince them to stay away, but her voice was drowned out by their desperation. They pushed open the door and stumbled inside, unaware of the darkness that awaited them. The interior of the cabin, as depicted in the camcorder footage, was almost identical to what I was seeing now, dusty, dilapidated, and filled with an oppressive sense of dread. But there were differences. There were signs that someone or something had been living here recently. There were strange symbols painted on the walls, crude drawings of grotesque figures, and piles of bones scattered in the corners. And there was something else, something that made my skin crawl, the unmistakable stench of decay. They tried to ignore the unsettling details, focusing on the fact that they had found shelter. They started a fire in the fireplace, hoping to ward off the cold and the darkness. They shared what little food they had left, trying to boost their morale. But the noises started again, louder and more menacing than ever before. They heard scratching at the walls, tapping at the windows, and the chilling sound of something breathing just outside the door. Mark, armed with a rusty axe he had found in the corner, stood guard, his face pale with terror. Emily huddled in the corner, whispering prayers under her breath. Jessica continued to film, her hands shaking as she captured the unfolding horror. And Sarah, her face etched with a mixture of fear and determination, tried to maintain control, urging everyone to stay calm and to stick together. Then the power went out. The fire in the fireplace flickered and died, plunging the cabin into complete darkness. A collective gasp of fear rose from the group. Mark swung the axe blindly, striking the wall with a loud thud. Emily screamed, her voice piercing the darkness. Jessica continued to film, her camera capturing only blackness. And then the screaming started. It was a blood-curdling, agonizing scream that echoed through the forest, a scream that spoke of unimaginable pain and terror. It was Mark's scream. Jessica fumbled with the camera, trying to find the source of the scream, but she could see nothing. Then another scream, this one from Sarah. And then silence. A chilling, absolute silence that was more terrifying than any scream. Jessica, her heart pounding in her chest, slowly panned the camera around the cabin, her eyes straining to see through the darkness. And then she saw it. A figure. Standing in the corner, shrouded in shadows, its eyes glowing with an unholy light. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long and slender. Its face was obscured by darkness, but Jessica could feel its gaze burning into her soul. The figure moved, gliding effortlessly across the floor, its movements fluid and unnatural. It reached out a long, skeletal hand and the camera went dead. The screen went black, the footage abruptly cut off. I sat there in stunned silence, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I had seen too much. I had witnessed the final moments of the Redwood Trail hikers, and what I had seen had shaken me to my core. I knew that I had to get out of there, that I couldn't stay in that cabin for another second. But as I stood up, I heard a noise. A faint scratching at the door. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. And then, a voice. A whisper, barely audible, but undeniably there. "Help us." I didn't wait to hear more. I grabbed my backpack, turned off my headlamp, and ran. I stumbled through the darkness, my feet pounding against the forest floor, my lungs burning with each breath. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew that I had to get away from that cabin, away from the darkness that had consumed the Redwood Trail hikers. I ran for what felt like hours, my mind racing with images of the figure in the cabin, of the screaming hikers, of the symbol etched into the doorframe. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the forest, where the trees thinned and the first rays of dawn began to break through the darkness. I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. I had made it. I had escaped the Blackwood Forest. But I knew that I would never be the same. The images I had seen, the sounds I had heard, would forever be etched into my memory, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked in the shadows. I knew that I should report what I had found to the authorities, but a part of me was afraid to. Afraid of what they would say, afraid of what they would think. And more importantly, afraid of what might happen if I drew attention to the Blackwood Forest. So I kept silent. I buried the camcorder deep in my backpack and vowed never to speak of what I had seen. But I couldn't forget. The story of the Redwood Trail hikers haunted me, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the darkness that awaits us all. I tried to move on to put the experience behind me, but it was no use. The Blackwood Forest had claimed a piece of my soul, and I knew that I would never truly be free. Weeks turned into months, and I tried to convince myself that it had all been a nightmare, a figment of my imagination. But then I started seeing the symbol. Everywhere. Etched into the walls of buildings, scrawled on the sidewalks, even appearing in my dreams. The circle with 3 inward-pointing arrows, a constant reminder of the darkness that had consumed the Redwood Trail hikers. It was as if the Blackwood Forest was calling to me, beckoning me to return. And then I received the package. A small, unmarked package delivered to my doorstep. Inside, there was only one thing, a small, intricately woven doll made of twigs and leaves. Its eyes were made of berries and its mouth was stitched shut with thorns. I knew then that I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to go back. I had to return to the Blackwood Forest and confront the darkness that had claimed the Redwood Trail hikers. I knew that it was a foolish, perhaps even suicidal, decision. But I had no choice. The forest had a hold on me and I couldn't escape its grasp. So I packed my backpack, gathered my courage, and prepared to return to the Blackwood Forest. This time I wouldn't be a passive observer. This time I would fight back. I drove back to the familiar, desolate trailhead, the air growing colder and heavier the closer I got. The trees loomed, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out, and the silence was profound, broken only by the frantic beating of my own heart. As I stepped onto the Redwood Trail, I felt a familiar dread creep into my bones. It was as if the forest itself was alive, aware of my presence, and waiting for me. This time, I didn't rely solely on the trail. I used the landmarks I remembered from the footage, the distinctive rock formations, the oddly shaped trees, the faint traces of the hiker's passage that still lingered in the undergrowth. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the oppressive silence was broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves, the snap of twigs, and the faint whispers that seemed to ride on the breeze. I felt like I was being watched, that unseen eyes were following my every move. As I ventured deeper into the forest, the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. The trees grew taller, their branches intertwining to blot out the sunlight, casting the trail in perpetual twilight. It was as if the forest was trying to suffocate me, to crush me under its weight. I pressed onward, driven by a mixture of fear and determination. I had to find the cabin. I had to confront the darkness that had consumed the Redwood Trail hikers. I followed the landmarks, my heart pounding in my chest, my senses on high alert. And then I saw it, the clearing. And in the center of the clearing, the cabin. It looked even more dilapidated and menacing than I remembered. The wooden walls were rotting, the roof was caving in, and the windows were like empty eyes staring out into the darkness. The symbol was still etched into the doorframe, a stark reminder of the evil that lurked within. I hesitated for a moment, my hand trembling as I reached for the door. But then I took a deep breath, steeled my nerves, and pushed it open. The door creaked open with a mournful groan, revealing the dark interior of the cabin. The air inside was thick with the stench of decay, and the silence was absolute. I stepped inside, my headlamp cutting through the gloom, revealing the familiar scene of desolation and decay. The furniture was still covered in dust. The bones were still scattered in the corners, and the strange symbols were still painted on the walls. But there was something different, something that made my blood run cold. In the center of the room, a circle had been drawn on the floor, using what looked like dried blood. And inside the circle, 5 figures were lying on the ground, arranged in a grotesque tableau. They were the Redwood Trail hikers, or what was left of them. Their bodies were emaciated and decaying, their faces contorted in expressions of unimaginable pain. Their eyes were missing, replaced by empty sockets that stared up at the ceiling, and their mouths were stitched shut with thorns, just like the doll. I gasped in horror, stumbling backward, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a scream. I wanted to run, to flee from the Sujus, but I was paralyzed with fear. And then I heard a noise. A faint rustling in the corner. I slowly turned my head, my eyes straining to see through the darkness. And then I saw it, the figure, standing in the corner, shrouded in shadows. its eyes glowing with an unholy light. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long and slender. Its face was obscured by darkness, but I could feel its gaze burning into my soul. The figure moved, gliding effortlessly across the floor, its movements fluid and unnatural. It reached out a long skeletal hand and I lunged for my backpack, frantically searching for the weapon I had brought with me, a silver-plated crucifix, blessed by a priest. I had no idea if it would work, but it was the only thing I had. The figure continued to approach, its eyes fixed on me, its presence radiating an aura of pure evil. I pulled out the crucifix, held it aloft, and screamed, "In the name of God, I command you to leave this place." The figure stopped, its eyes narrowing, its face contorting in a mask of rage. It let out a deafening shriek that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. And then it charged. I stood my ground, holding the crucifix high, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure lunged at me, its skeletal hand reaching for my throat. I closed my eyes and braced for the impact. But then I felt something, a surge of power, a wave of energy that emanated from the crucifix. The figure recoiled, hissing like a cornered animal. Its eyes flickered, its form wavered, and then, with a final, agonizing scream, it vanished. I stood there, trembling, my body soaked in sweat, the crucifix still clutched tightly in my hand. The silence returned, but this time it felt different. It felt lighter, less oppressive. I slowly opened my eyes and looked around the cabin. The bodies of the Redwood Trail hikers were gone. The circle on the floor had vanished, and the strange symbols on the walls had faded, as if they had never been there at all. The cabin was still dilapidated and decaying, but the oppressive sense of dread was gone. It was as if the evil had been purged, the darkness had been banished. I took a deep breath and slowly walked out of the cabin. The sun was shining brightly, the birds were singing, and the forest seemed to be alive with a renewed sense of hope. I had done it. I had confronted the darkness and emerged victorious. But I knew that my journey wasn't over. The Blackwood Forest may have been cleansed, but the evil that had lurked there was still out there, waiting to find another victim. And I knew that it was my duty to stop it, to protect others from the horrors I had witnessed, to fight back against the darkness, wherever it may be found. I turned and walked away from the cabin, away from the Blackwood Forest, my heart filled with a newfound sense of purpose. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that I was ready to face it. I was ready to fight, because I had seen the darkness, and I knew that it could be defeated. The horror had been real, the terror palpable, but so too was the power of good. And I would wield that power for as long as I lived. My journey was just beginning,